Steve, what were Monrovia's early newspapers?
The first newspaper was the Monrovia Planet. Began publishing in the fall of 1886. My guess is about November, but the first couple issues are missing. So you could roughly place it by later statements by the editor.
That's extremely early, considering they just had sold the lots,
Right.
the first lot. So one of the first things the founders must have done was get an editor, a newspaper
I
person.
think that they might have even donated a lot to E.L. Buck. The newspaper office was originally on the north side of Lemon in the 100 block. Fairly narrow, two-story building. Early pictures show an outside staircase. My assumption is that the editor may have lived upstairs over the newspaper office. It moved onto Myrtle Avenue several years later, but it started publication on the East Lemon Avenue location. At some point, a rival newspaper, The Leader, began publication. It didn't last all that long, probably because there wasn't that much business to support two local newspapers. The Planet was weekly. Probably The Leader was also a weekly newspaper. I think the Planet published on Thursday, anyway, midweek probably, or Thursday, and it carried everything. It had personals, advertisement, local news, national news, state news, and I think it was either 4 or 8 pages. Anyway, at some point, the two rival newspapers merged and became the Monrovia Messenger. And it was published, again, I believe weekly, until sometime in the 1920s. When it stopped publication, the printer, whoever was printing it at that time, stopped printing a newspaper, but kept printing materials. Kept producing printed material. At one point, it was at the southwest corner of Myrtle in Colorado, where the First National Bank was. It was actually in the First National Bank building after the bank had moved. It was probably there until the late 20s. Next newspaper I'm aware of is the Monrovia News, which started in 1903, I believe. Started by A.P. Seymour, who came to Monrovia from upstate New York. The Monrovia Daily was the news. Later on, they went to a daily, and both a daily and a weekly. So I think the daily was published Monday through Saturday, and then I believe that the news itself was published weekly on Saturdays.
Is that was it called the Daily News?
It was the Daily News. I think it might have started out, that's a good point. I'm not sure if it started out as a daily or if it started out as a weekly and then expanded to a daily.
So initially, it was either called the Monrovia News or the Monrovia Daily News.
And at one point, A.E. Cronenwet became associated with that newspaper, and later on, George and Harriet Berry became associated with the news. Don't know where the news started out. I think it might have been on East Olive. And then at one point they built a large 2-story brick building, East Lime, the 100 block of East Lime. And from there they moved to 119 West Palm, present site of the Monrovia Community Center. And the news, actually by that time it was the Daily News Post, because there had been another evening paper called the Post, published separately, and then those two merged to form the Monrovia Daily News Post. News Post published until 1974 at the Palm Avenue location, and then it went out of publication as a daily. There was the Another paper published in the teens, early teens. Wow. Anyway, published by C.N. Whitaker. And he was I don't pull any punches news reporter. In fact, he published something derogatory to some prominent Monrovia families. And the story is told that the sons of those families got together, ambushed him in the office, and beat him up. And I won't name names, but anyway. And then there's copies of the Monrovia Journal at the Monrovia Museum. I think the journal probably dates in the 1930s. None of those had the longevity of either the Messenger or the Monrovia News. Copies of the News exist at the Monrovia Public Library. Copies of the Messenger, the earlier copies, are also available at the library, but within the last 5 years, a bound volume of early Messengers showed up in Northern California and was sent back to Monrovia to be added to the archive, and it's been scanned by you, right, Sandy?
Mhm.
Yeah,
So it's in the Legacy Collection.
the Legacy Collection. And is it a year or 2 years?
It's 18 months.
18 months, okay.
I want to say 1911.
It would be
And
earlier,
12?
it's 1890s.
Okay, I
Yeah,
don't
well,
remember.
the same.
1891, 1892. Does that sound right?
It sounds right.
Okay.
Because the ones that serve the ones in file, I think that file ends with like March of 1891. So this would have been, I don't know if it was an exact continuation, but 1891 sounds correct, which is great to have. I did a search once on the Messenger, and I could find scattered random copies in various collections. I think the California State Library had some, the Museum of Science and Industry in Exposition Park, I think in their collection they had a couple. But there are some unscanned, I believe, at the random copies again at the Historical Museum. So the black hole of local newspaper history is basically from 1892 until about 1907, when copies of the Monrovia News exist and have been Myron Hotchkiss transcribed 1907. I believe the microfilm of those papers is in the library, and I think those have been scanned in their entirety. But there is that significant gap covering the 1890s and the early 1900s.
Do you want to talk a bit about the editors, the
Sure.
prominent editors?
E.L. Buck was the first that I'm aware of. J.W. Harvey probably took over in the fall of 1886 and continued on with the Messenger for a number of years. I mentioned A.P. Seymour, I mentioned George and Harriet Berry. I don't know when Charlie Davis went to work for the News. My guess would be mid-teens. He worked his way up to editor and was still the editor right up until the time of his retirement in 1957. He then devoted himself to a third local history. The first one being the history of Monrovia and Duarte that he wrote in connection with Emmett and Viola Norman, who covered the Duarte section of the history, published in 1938. 1943, he published the Monrovia Blue Book. And then I believe, right at the time of his retirement, he and his wife, Ella Vera Nelson Davis, worked on the Monrovia Duarte Community Book, which was published, I think the publication date's 1957. Charlie had a column that I can see in my mind's eye in the paper, on the front page of the paper, where he commented on local news items. Let's say somebody visited Monrovia who'd lived here in the early days, he'd include that information in his column about where they came from, what they remembered, where they were living now, etc. His wife, I think, was a society editor for a number of years before their marriage. I'm sure Harriet Berry wrote for the newspaper. I mentioned C.N. Whitaker. Those are the ones that come immediately to mind.
John Wiley?
John Wiley wrote for the local newspaper, had a column for a number of years, and in 1927 published his History of Monrovia, very simply History of Monrovia, starting with, he went way back, started with the Spanish colonialization and carried it through to the present time. In reading, I'm reasonably sure that he relied heavily on the proof copies or the galley copies of the Monrovia News that were in existence in that time. He perpetuated some of the misconceptions in terms of town size, just a few other things that were location of the first school, some inaccuracies. I have my annotated copy with the marginal no, but by and large he captured a whole lot of information from sources or from individuals who were still alive at the time and could give him firsthand anecdotal information to include in his history. That of course was not available later on.
Did he write that book while he was working at the newspaper?
I think he did. I think he did both simultaneously. There's in the Legacy collection, I think there were a series of his columns where he gave biographical information about Monrovians. Can't tell you the name of his column, but it's there. He'd say, you know, Mrs. So-and-so came to Monrovia, has been active with, so forth and so on. Just talked about their history with the community and their local activities. You mentioned Charlie Davis, and it's been said, probably with some truth, that he reflected public sentiment and didn't always report as thoroughly as he might have. Let's say he knew someone who was prominent in the community, who had a particular bias. It's probably true that Charlie did not write about something that would run contrary to that individual's bias. So there's the official history of Monrovia, and there's the unofficial and perhaps more factual history of Monrovia, told by people who experienced it firsthand and carried with them over the years the realization that not the whole truth was reported. The early newspapers served several roles. One was, of course, was to report local news. But the other was to create a propaganda vehicle that residents of Monrovia could send to their Midwestern family members and neighbors as an inducement to pull up stakes and move to Monrovia. I mean, he was a booster of the First Order. By he, I mean J.W. Harvey. But even later writers, for example, James S. Leonard, who married my dad's liberated Aunt Jessie, wrote for the local newspaper. And I've seen some of what he wrote, and he is fulsome in his praise of Southern California generally and Monrovia specifically. You know, this is God's heaven on earth. And of course he wrote for an Eastern market, or Midwestern and Eastern market. California is wonderful, Monrovia is even better, come live here. Join the rest of us who've had this epiphany about Southern California.
Is that perhaps why it was important so early on to have a newspaper so that it could attract people to settle?
You know, it was the newspaper or the news aspect to keep people well informed about what was going on locally, and there was the promotional aspect of why don't you subscribe and then why don't you buy extra editions and send them east. I mean, there's even reference in the early newspaper about last week's edition sold out, we could have printed 50 more, or something to that effect. So yeah, they were being circulated not only locally, but nationally in an effort to acquaint people with the benefit of living in Monrovia. And you know, what a wonderful place it was. The water's free, the climate's wonderful, you can grow anything. asthma and TB are unknown anyway. You get the picture.